Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Körber-Stiftung. Excellencies, ambassadors, members of the German Bundestag, dear guests, thanks for being with us. My name is Florian Bigger. I'm the program director of the Körber Emerging Middle Powers Initiative, shorthand CAMP, and it's a pleasure to have you all here for the launch of our report 2026. So before I sketch the lay of the land of this year's survey, I would like to express my gratitude to the partners of this initiative and report who will be joining us on stage shortly. It's Manjeet Kripalani from India, Paulo Esteves and Carlos Frederico Coelho from Brazil, Gustavo de Carvalho from South Africa, and Dino, Patti, Djalal from Indonesia. You did tremendous work. You did all the field work in your countries with your own networks, and we are really thankful for this partnership. So, what is CAMP? Sorry. Once a year, we survey the people who actually make and shape foreign policy in 5 countries. It's Brazil, India, Indonesia, South Africa, and Germany. So it's a foreign policy expert survey. So it's government officials, military and judiciary, diplomatic service, and so on. Why do we think this matters? I mean, there is certainly no shortage of opinion and analyses about where the world order is heading, why this rupture is happening, what middle powers are, and so on. And all these analyses, conferences, dialogues, they are very important, and in fact, they are the backbone of our work here at Körber-Stiftung. But what CAMP can add is not another map of where the roads might lead, but it's the traffic data. It tells us what these influential experts in 5 countries believe and want when it comes to building the new world order. So how does the world look right now, seen from Germany? This is the summer cover of the Foreign Policy magazine, and you see the end of, and then the list, and at the end, it's the end and of the future itself. And I believe this is too often how the West narrates this moment, as a series of endings. So the sand running out. We too rarely see these covers, the beginning of, because this moment can be perceived as an opening, and not only as a series of endings. I mean, a reordering is not only something happening to us, it holds room. It's also for us. And maybe we in the West are sometimes too lazy at asking where the openings are and how to cleverly use them. So our survey and report holds both the end of and the beginning of. So let me show you. First, the endings, and they are real. The end of trust in the United States, the end of the transatlantic reflex. 80% of experts across all 5 countries view US influence negatively. But, and this is the torn part in the report, the United States remains indispensable. For example, Brazil and Germany still rank it as their top partner. So the US is essential and unpopular at once. And then the end of institutions, of traditional institutions that inspire. Only 11% of German experts expect traditional multilateralism to return. So the United Nations, the WTO, they still function, they are still valuable, but they no longer inspire. And you might expect the great powers to step in and rebuild the international order, but no, the survey says no, because above all, they lack everyone else's trust. So the task falls, maybe, to the middle powers. And here the experts stop describing endings and start describing the beginnings and an architecture. The beginning of a plurilateral world, because across all 5 countries, the expected future is flexible coalitions, regional arrangements, issue-based partnerships. So it's basically building around the stalled institutions rather than waiting for them. It's about finding workarounds. And it's the beginning of middle power agency. I mean, this, what you see there on the slide, this is not resignation. Over 90% want to push for governance reform, defend sovereignty, and advance their regions. I mean, that is not a complaint, it's an agenda, a productive agenda. And Germany is right there with them on reform. So this is not a defensive global north, or however you want to call it, against an ambitious south, global south. Everyone wants a system reformed. Which brings me to the question underneath all of this. I mean, what does cooperation actually mean in this world? And here we find slightly differing views. I mean, everyone agrees on the form, a plurilateral regional world. But ask how to move in it, and two strategies seem to emerge. Germany's strategy is bind into a bloc. The European Union maybe as a strategic shield. It's the top foreign policy priority for 48% of German experts. The strategy of Brazil, India, Indonesia, and South Africa, each in their own way, is flexibility. It's balancing, hedging, keeping several partnerships in play. But this is not indecision. This is important. It's not indecision. It is a strategy with a long history and good reasons. So you see two answers to the same fragmenting world, and neither is naive. And you can see it in trade. I mean, half of German experts want resilience built through one big multilateral framework, the WTO, for example. And 72% of experts in the aforementioned countries want it built through many bilateral agreements. So the same goal, the same respect for rules, but you have two architectures. So what does all this add up to? Firstly, the great powers will not rebuild this order. Forget it. They are distrusted by the very countries that would have to follow. Secondly, the middle powers want to. I mean, the agenda is there, the will is there. The thing is, in my opinion, a world of coalitions and flexible partnerships runs on trust. So trust has become a strategic asset, one that must be built, sustained, and adapted to a fragmenting world. Because without it, no coalition can deliver. So to return to the foreign policy covers, the open question is, do we, especially in the West, have the imagination to see the openings and not only the losses? And this question I leave on the table for our panel to discuss. I'm delighted that Xifa, foreign policy correspondent of the German weekly Die ZEIT, will guide us through it, together with our partners. And I'm especially pleased that Deborah Düring, member of the Bundestag, will then share a first comment on the report and join the discussion. Xifa, Manjeet, Gustavo, Dino, and Carlos, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Right, let's move on the panel. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you Manjeet, Dino, Gustavo and Carlos for coming all the way to rainy Berlin. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm going to make a short introduction of the four of you. Gustavo, I'll start with you over there. You are the acting head of the African Governance and Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, and one of the leading experts on Russia-Africa relations. You've been working more than 15 years on multilateralism and Africa's engagement with external powers. Dino, you're the founder and chairman of Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia and Jakarta, which is the largest foreign policy organization in the Indo-Pacific. And previously you have served as Indonesia's ambassador to the US and as the deputy foreign minister, as well as foreign policy advisor to President Yudhoyono. You also wrote the opening essay of this report, and you lead the Middle Power Studies Network, so today's topic is quite your specialty. Manjeet, you're the co-founder and executive director of the Gateway House, the Indian Council on Global Relations in Mumbai. And before founding the institute, you were an award-winning journalist, working for Forbes magazine and also as the India bureau chief of Business Week. And last but not least, Carlos, you're a researcher at the BRICS Policy Center in Rio de Janeiro and the director of global synergy, as well as the professor of international relations at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. And your work focuses on international trade, US politics, and China-Brazil relations. Yeah, so Florian has already shown some of the core results. I will add on to, we've seen this one already, the dramatic drop in the valuation of the influence of the US. And interestingly, China's influence has improved a little bit, mostly, but has stayed more stable over the time of the past years. And what that results is in more and more countries preferring like a neutral or non-aligned stance. So my first question to all of the four panelists would be, we've seen emerging powers being tested in the past years by the American-Israeli war on Iran, by the Gaza war last year, by Trump's tariffs that hit a lot of your countries, and also by Russia's war against Ukraine in 2022. That's ongoing until today. And in each case, middle powers have borne significant costs, but have rarely been able to shape the outcome. So I'm wondering, do you think the middle power influence is real? We're talking about the middle power moment, as Canadian Prime Minister Makani has done so prominently earlier this year, or is this only wishful thinking? And where is concretely the space for middle powers to really shape events? Please. You want to start, Carlos?
Yeah, I can start. First of all, great to be here with everyone. This is the third edition, and I think one of the traits of the historical data shows us, which I think is very interesting, is that I remember the first year we had to explain a lot about middle power strategy, and right now we are seeing, for example, Germany converging almost to strategies that middle power used to use. So I think that's one point. I think this is a middle powers moment, but at the same time, this coalition or coalescence that we find in foreign policy right now is very much affected by what's going on in the United States. So that it helps coalesce interests. Middle powers need to do better among themselves in order to present also a cohesive strategy moving forward that is not dependent on the US or China.
Thank you. Manjeet, what do you think? What are the limitations and what are the
Yes,
middle power?
we actually have Shashi Tharoor, who leads our Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Policy, has put it very well that the middle powers have the ability to be the plumbing in the global system, but can rarely turn off the faucet when there's a flood. They don't have enough of the economic heft. They're really the foot soldiers of the world in that sense, and they don't have the ability to reach out and stop things the way the superpowers can. And so the middle powers are left holding the baby, as it were. And part of the reason also that they don't want to take a stand is because they require the flexibility. I think that's the key word for the middle powers. They need to be flexible, and what is viewed as inconsistency and inability to act is really the need to be flexible and make sure that they survive rather than take an ideological stance. So during this time, India is the chairman of BRICS this time, and many of the countries that were involved in this war in Iran are part of BRICS. But then you've got this odd situation where Iran, Saudi Arabia are all part of BRICS. I mean, when you've got two opposing sides and the UAE in the same grouping, you know, unless you're Abraham Lincoln and can build this, you know, coalition of the team of rivals, it's very hard to stop to create something that can work. So,
Dino, in your country, most experts have given. Well, they said like all the other countries here in the room, and they are not that important to Indonesia. Most of them rank lower than 50%. Why is that?
First, let me answer that question about the middle power moment. I'm glad you mentioned the U.S.-Iran war, because that actually affirms the importance of middle power, because the U.S., the invincible superpower against Iran, and guess what? U.S. is not winning. Iran is seen by many to be prevailing at this point. And who's mediating? Another middle power, which is Pakistan. And one of the biggest worry is let's not have Saudi join the conflict, and Saudi is a middle power. The Russia-Ukraine war, Russia we don't see as a great power, we see it as a middle power. Ukraine also as a middle power. So I think a lot of the conflicts that we see and a lot of the architecture buildings, a lot of these pieces, middle powers are a great part of it. Now, you asked about, in the report, Brazil, India, and South Africa is favored less than China, Australia, Japan, even Russia. Again, I think it's work in progress. I think we see Brazil a lot as a football superpower. India civilizational not today. Sorry. But in geopolitical and economic terms, I think those countries, China, Japan, United States, Germany is at 40%. Not bad. But I think we're starting to come to terms with the importance of middle powers to our foreign policy. You know, perceptions are really shifting very fast now in Indonesian strategic mindset. So
thank you, Gustavo. So what's the view from South Africa? Is there really increasing cooperation between the middle powers?
Thank you, and thank you once again for organizing this. I think when we're thinking about the middle power moments, there is a couple of things that we need to reflect about. One, what are middle powers? Who is a middle power? Who is not? Traditionally, that is a concept that was historically applied to countries like Canada, like Australia, very order conforming, and countries that have benefited historically from the idea of international rules-based order, whatever that was. I think what brings these countries together, I think it's something that Florian presented in his slides, is why does countries that we consider to be middle powers tends to like multilateralism so much. We see ourselves as not be that small that we have no influence and ability to project power, but neither are we that big, which means that by pooling resources, by coming together, by working with multilateral institutions that allow us to benefit more when it comes from those international interactions. But when that is added to the fact that we start, and from a South African point of view, that is very clear, that we see the existing global order not only problematic, but very risky. The fact that we over-rely on one power versus the other, that simply make us much weaker when we want to pursue. We know we are not in a unipolar moment, and the United States remains a very big superpower, but perhaps not that big that it's able to provide us all of those things that we want and need. We know that China is rising and is able to provide a lot of things for us, but neither are they that big that is able to provide all of those things that we want and need. So in that sense, what becomes a point of commonality between all of us, in that sense, is the willingness of having more choices. that we diversifying those risks by interacting with a wider range of actors, because simply over-reliant on only one player is simply too risky for us. And that's certainly the perspective that we increasingly see from countries like South Africa.
Thank you. Gustavo has just mentioned over-reliance. Now, Carlos, I want to ask you, around 80% of the experts in Brazil favor non-alignment. But at the same time in the survey, China is named as Brazil's most important bilateral partner now, way ahead of the US, and the relationship with Washington has been pretty much strained by tariffs, but also like ideological disputes with the Lula government. So can Brazil still claim to be non-aligned and not choosing sides, or and what are the trade-offs of moving closer to China?
Well, first of all, I think we need to realize that China has been Brazil's largest economic partner. This is not 2 years ago, 3 years ago. This is taking place since 2009. So China right now is responsible, and to your point, of 30% of more or less Brazil international trade. When the Trump tariffs came, of course, Brazil was very significantly impacted. But the trade with the US is 12%, which is our second largest partner. Brazil would like to live in a world where, just as Gustavo mentioned, we would have a lot of flexibility. And the preference, I would say, and so why is China the most important bilateral partner? It's because of these economic ties. And when it comes to foreign investment, also China is number one investment in Brazil, which should be a message also to Europeans in that we should connect on those kind of issues. And Brazil is looking to diversify, and I think there's an essay from Tatiana Prazeres, who is responsible for foreign trade, with the report that mentions how is Brazil trying to diversify its trade. It's easily said than done, as you know, also here in Germany. So we would like to live in a world of flexibility. Right now, China offers more flexibility than the US. And that is a blunt statement, but also a true statement.
Right. And are there any trade-offs for moving closer to China and alienating Washington?
Well, I think we're living some of these trade-offs, and I think this poses a particular challenge for Brazil right now. But if the U.S. takes the same strategy towards other partners as well, then you're going to have to start choosing. What I would alert my American friends right now is that structurally, there's not a lot of reasons why Brazil should align with the United States. So why I would favor diversification, but the United States should be aware that it doesn't have the clout that it once had.
Thank you. That is a very interesting statement. Gustavo, I want to talk about the relationship between South Africa and Washington that also has dramatically soured. The Trump administration has accused South Africa of mistreating the country's white minorities. Washington has cut development aid and imposed very high tariffs as well. And now Trump has excluded South Africa from joining the G20 summit this year. Yet, Foreign Minister Robert Lamola argues also in the report that South Africa can still maintain constructive relations with the United States. How realistic is that assessment after everything that's happened?
I think it's an important comment, and perhaps go back to the idea of what is non-alignment for a country like South Africa, and perhaps to start with what non-alignment is not. No country that talks about non-alignment is talking about an issue of neutrality. Neutrality would assume and presuppose that we are looking for an idea of equidistance between powers and that we are right in the middle between them, not making choices. I think perhaps a better way, and there are particular reasons and perhaps historical, emotional, political reasons why a country like South Africa prefers that term, that is a country that is looking to have autonomy and choices within that behavior and to be able to have the flexible interaction around that. That is directly relevant to the bilateral relationship with the United States and has often to do with not only how South Africa perceives the international relations environment, but how the United States perceives South Africa itself. Of course, over the years, we had often very confusing propositions and presentation of positions from South Africa itself, but largely one that gave a number of opportunities for a country like the US to seize and set South Africa as an example. We had a very tense and difficult relationship prior to Donald Trump when it came to South Africa's position after the invasion of Ukraine, or what I would call the lack of a position. I think we had for at least a year and a half too many narratives within the country that simply made it really hard to know who is actually speaking on behalf of the United States. South Africa initiated a case in the International Court of Justice against Israel, claiming that South Africa believed there was a genocide ongoing within that, and it asked for a multilateral institution. And I think the choice of venue in that sense is particularly important, not necessarily to agree or disagree with the government, but one of there was a deliberate choice to utilize the International Court of Justice as a space for that. But South Africa's response, I think, especially since Donald Trump came into power, and particularly after South African ambassador was expelled from Washington in March last year, has been a particularly cautious one. Because we may have a lot of these agreements with the United States, but it's simply not a choice for the country to fully move away from it. But also it believes it has some leverage that neither has the United States, both in terms of the importance of South Africa, in terms of investments of American companies, both in terms of South Africa's position in critical supply chains on critical minerals. The Platinum Group, it's primarily dependent on South Africa. Over 90% of global production comes within South Africa. What we have seen is that publicly, and I will close now, we have a much more tense relationship. In practice, there is an attempt from both sides of let's continue, let's maintain a certain space of civility within our bilateral relationships until we figure out what are the best ways in which these two countries can engage with one another.
Thank you, Gustavo. Now I want to move on to the next chart, which is how do you evaluate the influence of Russia in your country? And India here really stands out. India experts rank Russia as the most important partner. And at the same time, they voice also the highest trust in the US among the experts that we see here, which is quite staggering. So Manjeet, I want to ask you, I mean, India sees itself as an important partner of the West, but also Russia is still ranked number one. That sounds like an impossible tightrope act. So I wonder, what is it? Is it balancing, hedging? What is the rationale in Delhi?
It is actually the truth. Russia has been a very good friend to India in the past for many years. It continues to be a very good friend. And we are actually deepening our relationship with Russia because the US is our future. It's been a country with which we've had a mixed relationship, partly because of its very special relationship with Pakistan that it continues. And so India really cannot rely on the US so much. And so it continues its friendship with Russia, but the US is the future. We've just, hopefully going to we'll ratify a free trade agreement with them. But it's a lot of P2P, person-to-person relationships, business to business, and some government to government engagement. But I think that our trust will always remain with Russia. And over time, we're still due to, in terms of defense equipment, we're buying a lot more from the US. But I think we'll still be depending on Russia for some of the futuristic equipment, partly because the US will still give the same equipment to Pakistan, et cetera, et cetera. And now, particularly, the US has, it will have a détente with China. They're going to come to a trade détente with China. That worries India terribly, because we don't know what that means for us. And Marco Rubio came to India recently, and he made a statement that the US would never make the same mistake with India as they made with China. They would never allow India to become so integrated with the US. So we have to keep them at a distance, keep them as friends. English-speaking countries and democracies, that's great, but we have to still, they have to win our trust.
Thank you, Manjeet. Dino, we just discussed briefly why Indonesian experts don't see other middle powers as that important yet. As we speak today, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is visiting Indonesia and talking to President Subianto. And yeah, I wonder, only 37% of Indonesian experts at this moment consider India important for their country. What do you think might be an outcome of the meeting this week, and where do you see potential for more cooperation? And then a second question, if I may. Why do 71% of Indonesian experts rate the government foreign policy negatively?
Okay. Maybe my ambassador would like to answer. Look, we are talking about middle powers. There's about 20 middle powers among the 193 countries. This is judging from the size, capacity, and ambition. Yeah. And so within the 20 or so middle powers, you have different levels too. There are pivotal middle powers. There are those who are just, average, and there are those who are underperforming middle powers. I don't name who, but we definitely see India as a pivotal middle powers. India pushed hard for leadership of the Global South and managed to push African Union to join the G20. And when we look at the Indian Ocean, we know that is India's backyard. Yeah. And I think if you look at countries in the Global South, very few can play leadership role. Brazil is doing important role, in that space, but India also is playing that role. Indonesia is yet to punch above weight in terms of leadership in the Global South. And under President Prabowo, he has stated that the strategic partnership with India is going to be quite important. He is a chief guest last year, is it this year?
Yes, last year.
And they have signed a number of strategic defense agreements and so on. So I think Indonesia and India are recalibrating our relationship beyond the non-alignment relationship that existed in the past. Yeah.
Can I?
Yes, of course, please.
So actually, we're about to do a deal maybe with the BrahMos, the missile, which is a joint India-Russia production missile that is working very well in South Asia. And don't forget that the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, has been kind of, at this moment, abandoned by the US. It's just not interested in it. That leaves Australia, Japan, India, and then with 3 additional partners in the Indo-Pacific, which is Indonesia, South Korea, and the Philippines. Now, this is the Indo-Pacific is our shared home. And so this relationship, the Indonesia-India relationship, is starting to become very, very important.
One small detail. Indonesia's trade with India now exceeds Indonesia's trade with the United States. Yeah, just very recently. So I think that's quite significant.
Manjeet, you just mentioned that the Quad have been abandoned by the US, basically. Is BRICS becoming more important? I mean, India is chairing BRICS this year. And I want to ask you about the fact that BRICS were not able to come up with a joint statement addressing the war in Iran recently. Is this missed chance? Do we also see limitations here of what BRICS
Yes,
do?
exactly. So within the BRICS, you do have all these warring countries within it. It became very difficult to make a joint statement, to come up with something. But actually, India should have used its chairship to do better, because during the non-aligned movement, when India was quite prominent in the non-aligned movement, when Iran and Iraq went to war, there were 4 countries that got together and went to Iran, Iraq, went to observe and issued a statement. So India should have done that as BRICS president, even issue a statement. ASEAN came up with a statement, but we did not. I feel that has been one of our, one of our failures as BRICS president. We have to see what the rest of the world, rest of the year shows.
I mean, what can BRICS really do also when India and China are, rivals and have so many tensions and conflicts?
They've been managing it quite well so far. And don't forget that BRICS is seen as the alternative to the G7. It's been, and now with Indonesia and BRICS, it really strengthens India's hand to a very large extent. I don't think this has been repeated by our foreign ministers, that BRICS, etc., are not anti-Western groupings. These are non-Western groupings. They just don't want to repeat the same mistakes as the other ones. And the BRICS is really a middle powers it is a middle powers grouping. And none of them are able to do very much. They're novices at this game. They're not allies, but they're partners. And so I think this is an evolving situation where they will find common cause, and they will, with pragmatism rather than with an ideological eye, come out with some changes that they themselves need to see in the world.
Dino, you want to add?
Yeah, I just a quick one. I agree that BRICS is an alternative to G7, but BRICS is so far away from becoming like a G7 in terms of political, economic, strategic coordination. You know how they are so tight together, right? Miles away, right? Secondly, BRICS need to change their name. Right?
Yes.
Indonesia is not comfortable joining a group called Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Right?
BRICS Plus.
Yes. They got to change the name. If they want to make it more credible and have everybody.
Yeah.
Just something very briefly on that. I think the interesting thing with BRICS and what we have seen since its creation is perhaps, and part of the fact that it makes it an interesting grouping is the fact that we have very dissimilar countries that are interacting with one another probably very little. We trade a lot with China, all of us, but perhaps far less with one another, which very much often what it does is that it forces its members to agree to disagree all the time. BRICS as a grouping has no issues with saying that this is a bit too controversial. We're not able to find consensus on what is a common position within BRICS around the invasion of Ukraine. What it does is the pursuit of minimum common denominators. What it does is to identify these are perhaps the 2, 3, or 10 issues that we can find agreement on, that we can actually engage with one another to find better ways of cooperation. And what it does as a result is that BRICS rarely, if not never, interacts with critical geopolitical issues as a result. Because it's really hard to find within the group a minimum common denominator, and makes us deal with the things that we actually find it to be important as that group, opening the space for individual members to find other forums, other venues to pursue the things that perhaps we're not going to be able to find within BRICS itself.
Carlos, you also wanted to
just
briefly
very shortly. So on page 28 of our report, there's some responses on BRICS, and to Gustavo's point, most of the respondents from BRICS countries see BRICS as an engine for economic growth and economic development, which might differ from the perspective that other countries have of BRICS. So I think that's one. And the second one, and I think we do have to recognize that the enlargement of BRICS have made it much more difficult to coordinate. And possibly right now we are in this moment of trying to find the lowest common denominator so it can move ahead.
Thank you. Now I want to raise a topic that is maybe not so comfortable for the audience here, is the question of why Germany just failed to win a UN security seat.
I thought you were going to mention the World Cup, sorry.
Well, that as well.
I thought we agreed not to talk about the World Cup.
Okay, understood. Okay. Gustavo, I want to ask you first because, well, there have been differences, obviously, in the last couple of years, especially when it comes to the question of Israel, Palestine. But maybe you could give me a South African perspective on why Germany has lost diplomatic influence over the past years.
I think certainly if we're looking to two major crises that we've seen over the years, full scale of invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the crisis in Gaza, for a lot of countries in the global south that became very representative of, I think, first, that no country has the monopoly of hypocrisy and no country has the monopoly of inconsistent foreign policies. What we saw, for instance, in 2022 and most of 2023, it was a lot of pressure to South Africa to say, why are you with them, not with us? Despite the fact that I think what most countries were doing at that stage, that this is not existential to us. This is an important global crisis, but this is not fundamentally within our hierarchy of priorities. And the things that we are thinking about on calculations in terms of where do we position and what types of political costs we want to have. What we saw with the Gaza crisis was a reverse issue. And that reverse issue, I think, brings a lot of skepticism around some of that idea of moral high grounds that we often being presented to. To a certain degree, that makes it much harder for a country like Germany in terms of bringing traditional narratives of this is what it's morally right to do, when there is at least a perception from that side that we don't necessarily think that your response has been the morally right one. And second, I think also that understanding that if we're not with you, we are against you. What I think it brings in terms of an opportunity for middle countries like Germany, like South Africa to interact, is that we need to learn how to agree to disagree more. We need to be able to identify that this is an area that we perhaps would have deep disagreements about, but there is other 20 areas where we can agree. I've done some work a couple of years ago where we were looking into are African countries voting more with China and Russia in the UN Security Council? And the answer is no. More than 90% of the times there is a combination of votes of African countries and Western countries. And I think that in itself shows that there is a number of issues that we can agree on. But we need to be able to have the ability of identify that we're not always going to have the same views and positions on everything. And that perhaps is a lesson or at least an insight that the German foreign policy should have.
Mm. But let me follow up on that. Why does South Africa push toward international law when it comes to Israel, but not when it comes to Russia vis-à-vis Ukraine?
I don't think that South Africa didn't. I think what we need to look for, I think particularly in 2022, 2023, if you look for what narratives were coming from South Africa, they were strangely consistent, but within different voices. Ministry of Defense was saying one thing, the Department of International Relations was saying another, certain factions within the ruling party were, and in a moment where particularly President Ramaphosa was weak enough that he simply couldn't control the narrative. The pressure became unsustainable for South Africa, especially when the United States ambassador calls up a press conference and accuses South Africa of trading weapons with Russia. Eventually, no evidence was found in a commission of inquiry. That what it then brought was South Africa to become much more clear where it came from. The African Peace Initiative that South Africa and other 6 African countries did to Kyiv and St. Petersburg is an important example. It's often presented as a peace plan from Africa. It wasn't. What it was a position paper with 10 points. If we look into those 10 points, and we've done that assessment, most of them are actually more pro-Ukraine than they are pro-Russian. When it comes to the issue of sovereignty, issue of inviolability of international borders, the South African participation on the Ukraine peace formula, participated in all of the rounds of discussions, whether in Malta, whether in Jeddah, whether in Copenhagen. And even the South African position when it came to what is that we think that is the solution to that, it became far less controversial than what it was in 2022, 2023, and perhaps for some of 2024. There was the issue of dialogue. When it comes to the issue of Gaza, that was simply more important in the hierarchy of priorities for the South African state. Historically, it's the most important non-African issue in South African foreign policy. And perhaps for us looking into those issues more closely, we would have been surprised if South Africa did nothing rather than it did something. What it does represent is not necessarily a selectivity of what cases should have the attention of international law or not, but simply what cases are we willing and able to pay the costs to be at the forefront of that.
Dino, I want to ask you, do you share that view that Gustavo just voiced? Or, I mean, if, from your perspective, what should Germany do to increase its diplomatic way to gain more trust internationally again?
Well, to be honest, I was quite surprised that Germany did not get elected to the UN Security Council seat. And, Indonesia has campaigned many times on positions where we thought we would win and we didn't get it simply because we didn't campaign enough. We didn't spend enough resources. So I don't know what is behind this. I suppose that Germany did the best that they could. But I do agree with Gustavo that to many countries, Gaza has become the defining issue in world affairs. And perhaps that has, perhaps that has something to do with it. Yeah.
Carlos?
Go ahead, Manjeet.
I was wondering, what can Europe or Germany do, like starting tomorrow, to gain more influence?
I think trade offers an avenue, and I think here in Germany, probably preaching to the choir, because Germany has supported the negotiations of trade between the European Union and Mercosur. I think if we go to a neighboring country of Germany, we would have a little bit more trouble with that, and we still do. The agreement is provisional. It's sort of working, but I think we would like more transparency on that. There's space for investment in terms of transfer of technology. I can speak about Brazil, but I think it works for other countries as well in the global south. We would like to have more options, and we wouldn't like to be tied down either to China or the United States. So I think if Europe listens to that, then I think right now is really the moment in which those partnerships can take place.
Thank you, Carlos. Now I would like to welcome Deborah Düring to give the first comment on the report from a German perspective. Ms. Düring is member of the Bundestag, foreign policy spokesperson of the Green Party, and her party's lead member on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Deborah, please. Yes.
It's okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the discussion and this really great report. Maybe I start with the things I think we are having in common, and then at the end I'm ending about the Security Council thing. So I would say, and we saw there, that there's a huge agreement about that the US under Donald Trump have more or less a negative influence on all this issue we are raising. And I think you also pointed it out, we are having different opinions on how do we see China and Russia in this world. I mean, Germany have a really clear perspective on Russia at the moment, and we also are working on the risk from China, but we also see that we are having a huge dependency at the moment. And on the other hand, at the moment, we are also trying to de-risk from the US, because we are seeing there's a huge dependency. And I mean, you mentioned it, the middle powers maybe are the solution. I was in Brazil, I think 3 days ago with the foreign minister, so I can totally agree on the issues you raised about trade and now finding more contact with middle powers to getting over all this dependency. But yeah, it's a tough work we are having to do. And I would maybe then point out that the question of international order, and that's also pointed out in the report, I mean, there are experts expected the future international order to be built more around multiple partnerships rather than one dominant global system. And I'm not sure if this really would be the way we are having to go, because from a German side, I see that middle powers maybe don't want to run in the direction of the USA or China, but I think that at the end, it's really important that we are on the same value base, right? And that the multilateral system at the end is not only trade, that the multilateral system also is sharing values about how do we deal with the climate crisis and where we can like support each other. How do we support labor rights, or do we stop child work and all these issues? I think it's nothing only about values, it's something about stability, about security, and we are all having to deal with all these issues. So I would argue for dealing or like building up pragmatic coalition, but on a base of the same values and international order and international law. And there will come to the Security Council disaster, I would say. And I mean, from the Green side, we are now not in power anymore. So for the opposition, it's always really easy to say that. But at the end, it's nothing only, not only because of the government we are having now. I think it's something also we, and as Greens, were part of the government before, and we also weren't clear in all the issues, for example, on the international law. And I was interested, like I listened that you only mentioned Gaza. I think, I don't know how it is for your countries, but for me, that Germany didn't speak up on Venezuela was even, I mean, Gaza, I know it's an issue for the last few years, but the Venezuela case, I think, well, when we don't speak up, when there's a partner like the US, like violating international law, like you can't debate it, it's like really clear, then sure, it will have consequences. And I mean, it's clear that Germany has a different role if we are talking about Israel. But if we are talking about Venezuela and about the US, I think that's where I think there was a tipping point. So my suggestion would be that Germany is doing more pragmatic partnerships with middle powers, but never forget your value-based system. And I mean, it doesn't mean that you can't deal with partners where we don't agree on 100%, but it means that we speak up. That if there is a human rights issue, then let's talk about the human rights issue. And we can make deals with each other, but you also have to speak up if there is something going wrong. And I also hope that other countries are doing the same when things are happening here in Germany. So I would say being really clear on international law, speak up even if your friends are not doing really good, and trying to find new partners, but never forget your value-based order. And at the end, I think we have to invest more in multilateral organizations, not less.
Deborah, 53% of German experts now support a non-aligned stance for Germany as well. Germany being new to the non-alignment game, I was wondering, what do you think that the country can learn from other emerging middle powers?
Well, I would say we are having to learn a lot because we are new in this game. And at the end, we are doing it, right? We are the foreign ministers traveling around the world, finding new partners, finding new value-based order partnerships. So at the end, I think we can learn from other countries, for example, how they are dealing with I agree to disagree movements, for example. But at the end, I would always argue not to forget the rule-based order.
Thank you. Do any of the other panelists want to react to Deborah's statements?
Just to say, Germany should not worry about not being elected to the Security Council. There are groups of losers. We've all been there. There's no problem. You're in a good place. And the rules-based order, as you see it, actually requires change. So if you can join hands with us and try and find more equitable rules, then you stand a better chance.
Dino, please.
On the rules-based, look, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. That's against international law, right? And middle power closing, for whatever reason, the Strait of Hormuz. What did other middle powers do? We actually reaffirm the need to respect international law. Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, right, said, look, what happened in Hormuz will not happen in the Strait of Malacca. So I think the response to those who violate international law should be to reaffirm the importance of international law, right? And to do so frequently. And on Germany, I think my best advice is, look, it's really competitive now to be the influence in other regions, to be the partner of choice. You know, the reason why China is winning a lot, China really is competitive in the way they entice and embrace these countries. You know, their public diplomacy budget is more than any other countries, right? The kind of economic or trade facilities that they give to other countries, and so on and so on. Japan was the flavor of the decade last year, but they lost out to China somehow because China is more competitive. The U.S. is out, as we saw, because the U.S. just not competitive anymore in terms of soft power and so on. So I think if Germany wants to have a strong presence in the Indo-Pacific, you just got to compete, you know, on public affairs, right, on economic engagement, and to be a persistent actor, right? The U.S. is not seen as not just dependable, not dependable and also not consistent, whereas China is seen to be dependable and steady, right? India also is seen to be steady. You know, Modi's been around for some time and advocating the same strategic concept. So that's my advice to Germany.
Do you also have advice to Germany, Gustavo?
No, I think your point on values is very important, and I think perhaps we often bring this dichotomy between values versus interests. That I think a foreign policy that is only interest-based becomes realpolitik, which you probably understand much better than I do, considering it's a concept that was born in this country. But also where and how values are presented is also important, because values without interest often leads to conversations that are too superficial. And I often say this, part of the challenges of Pan-Africanism is that it's often centered almost entirely on values and ideas of solidarity without necessarily having that idea of interdependence that makes it much stronger. But perhaps more worrying to me is when we present values as masking interests. And I think that is a narrative that is becoming very visible within the global south. Ideas of, is this really about values of climate, or are these ideas of protectionism to our own markets? Are these really widely implemented and presented ideas of human rights, or is the selectivity of some of that implementation reduces the strength of the very narrative that it wants to be part of? And what does it mean when we have the same values but are looking from different interests? Where there are discussions around compensations and on climate issues, where there are issues around reparations for slavery. I think all of those issues, we need to talk a little bit more openly about them, because part of what I think there is a benefit for a discussion that is leading towards a much more transactional space, what it does is that the cards are on the table and allow us to say, like, these are our values, but these are the limitations we have to fully implement those values. Because that on its own, I think it's something that countries can really create more spaces to identify how we actually find middle grounds.
Carlos, do you also want to respond to Deborah on shared values?
No, I think there's recognition. I think Gustavo put it rather elegantly, as he does. There is a lot of frustration when it comes to the relationship between the global south and more established powers. I think that was first with the United States, and I think I'm not happy that now Germany is living through it, but you're now having some of the frustration that we have had to live for decades, if not centuries. So maybe now you understand us better. And if you do, then I think there's room for all of these conversations. That okay, so when we talk about values, well, we have been defending international law. It's for a long, long time because we didn't have the material capabilities to do otherwise. And our choice has always been to work within the multinational arena. This has been a main tenet of Brazilian foreign policy for ages. It's enshrined in our constitution. So I think we are ready to have that conversation. And we hope that others, Germany included, are ready as well to have a proactive conversation about this, because we are now all sharing the same constraints.
Xifa, just very quickly, my foreign minister said in a meeting with, my former foreign minister said in a meeting with leaders of the North, welcome to our world. Because all these things, inconsistencies, double standards, and these were imposed on us for many decades, and we kept complaining, but nobody listened. Now you're complaining, welcome to our world.
Well, thank you for being so frank. I think, to be honest, this is the perfect moment to hand it over to the audience. And we have 15 minutes left for questions. And yeah, you want to go first?
Well, if I may. Johan from the Federal Foreign Office. One short remark and then maybe two short questions to Manjeet. The short remark, I'm not sure about the idea of non-alignment, if it maybe overstretches the idea of non-alignment if you place Germany in that group. I mean, we're still members of NATO, where even if NATO is not maybe in the same state it used to be before Trump, but still we're a member of an alliance. So it's and even if we are working on finding other partners, diversifying our relationships, I think it's still different from non-alignment. And the two questions I'm interested in concern India, actually. First of all, Manjeet, you mentioned that you still see Russia as your most important partner and trusted partner, and with the US would be part of the future. Where do you see Europe in that in that constellation? Because you didn't mention Europe at all. And then I keep wondering, if you talk about trust in Russia, if you see like the triangle Russia, India, China, and you see Russia's growing dependency on China in many regards, how does that influence your strategic thinking?
Manjeet, do you want to answer directly?
Yes. So Europe is very important to India. As you know, we've just concluded a free trade agreement that's going to be waiting to be ratified. India and Europe have more in common than India and the US, that's for sure. But it's been so long. We've been waiting 25 years for this trade agreement to come about. Same with Mercosur. It's taken a very long time. This is really a perfect moment for India and the EU to start its engagement, and we're much more comfortable with Europe than we are with other countries. I would say that. So we're looking forward to a good relationship with the EU, and we hope that we will not be under the same constraints as maybe the UK was in terms of our trade, which is why they had to leave. So hopefully, India, being so practical, and Mercosur also will kind of soften some of the edges that a developed country and concessions a developed country has to make for a developing country. That's one thing. And on Russia, the second question was on Russia, China, India. Well, we have this grouping, RIC. We kind of understand why Russia had to go to China. It's not optimum. I don't think they like it at all. But there's no other place to go. The US has kind of rejected Russia. Europe has rejected Russia. There's no place for them to go.
Well, Russia has invaded Ukraine. I mean, it's not.
It is. We can go over this argument, but the point is, I was in Moscow just about 10 days ago. They really do feel very rejected, and part of it is now that this is just the impression I have from listening to all the conversations, that they're really ready for this to end, and they feel that there's too much interference in the fight between Russia and Ukraine, and maybe they should have been able to work it out for themselves. But there is no chance if Europe is going to keep encouraging Ukraine to just fight instead of bringing them to the negotiating table. None of that has been happening. I know Germany and the EU doesn't see it that way, but from the outside, it certainly looks that way. And the Africa Peace Initiative was just dismissed out of hand. So, I mean, these are things that Europe doesn't see it that way. You see it from your own view, but from the rest of the world's view, it really does look like there is no place for diplomacy there. So in terms of China, we have to accept what Russia does, but at least it doesn't impinge on the India-Russia relationship. There's no China in there.
Sorry, I have to reply to that.
Yes.
Because I still would say Russia could end it basically any day. It's not Europe, it's not the Ukraine that does not want to negotiate. Russia could end this war any day.
We could, yeah.
I think we could discuss this, for the rest of the day, actually, and this for sure will stay a point of contention. But maybe we can have some other questions also. Yeah, please, in the back. Yeah.
Yes, I'm Christian Vorwig. I'm with the Ministry of Economic Affairs, and I'm responsible for trade policy there. And in this regard, from this background, I would have a question on diversification in trade. It was mentioned several times here. We have FTAs from the EU with I think all of you sitting here. India and Indonesia recently concluded. Mercosur is in force already, South Africa for many years. But if we want, on the point of diversification, we would like to work closer with middle countries, with middle powers. How can we do this? We can do it, of course, one by one on FTAs, but perhaps do you see in the long term a kind of mechanism to work closer together with these countries in order to diversify from the big ones, from the US, from China? We can go for the WTO, but I was surprised about the slide where several answers were, well, the WTO is perhaps not the place to do this. What would be then the place? Perhaps the CPTPP agreement or something where many countries in the Trans-Pacific are members, and not forget about Canada, Mexico. We also see them as middle powers. Would be curious on your response.
I can.
You go first. No.
So, first of all, we need to move faster. I think that has been an issue with the European Union. I think on the Mercosur side as well, but much more in the European Union. And I think you also need to be aware of the issue of trust, so that we don't fall into the same categories, for example, that we clearly see the U.S. falling right now. When it comes to the Mercosur-European Union agreement, every time, it was time to conclude the agreement, it's okay, let's open another discussion. And then there's, okay, let's we have this green policy here that, well, we see it as a protectionism device. And then after the agreement was enforced, I think it was just last week or 10 days ago that there was a major blockage of exports from Brazil. So I think, and while this is happening, China is coming in, and so I think it also goes to the question you mentioned, values, and of course we value values, but there's also a practicality of things that needs to be addressed, and so I think the speed of things is one thing. How can it move faster? I don't know from the European Union side. I think in South America, especially in Mercosur, I think there are discussions in place for countries to be a little bit more flexible in exercising their preferential trade agreements. So I don't know if that's possible within the current framework of the European Union, but the timing of things definitely affected.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador from Indonesia, you wanted to raise.
Thank you so much. I will be very brief. This question for any one of you wishes to respond. Speaking of the middle power moment, we need to talk about how to leverage the material capability of the middle power. And some may suggest that maybe we need to consider building a new kind of coalition. Maybe this very niche, specific issue coalition, very informal and less institutionalized. I'm just wondering, what is your take on this? Thank you.
Do we want to have another question? Maybe let's do two, and then the panelists can respond. In the back.
Michael Krake from the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. The report we're discussing today has recommendations to a country like Germany. I mean, obviously, since it's emerging middle powers and the more traditional middle power from the global north, Germany. And the discussion here is often, what should Germany do? My question to you is, since Germany is part of the European Union, we often have to ask ourselves strategically, where should we act as Germany? That can be on trade and economic cooperation, probably a bit more than on many political issues. If you want to shape, for example, the multilateral order and the institutions, the question is, how far can you get if you want to have leverage as a country as Germany? We would usually opt to act as a European Union on this. But my question to you is, who's for you the more trusted partner? Is it a country like Germany or France or Italy, or is it the European Union? How do you and your countries and policymakers look at this?
So yeah, let's hand it back to the panelist who wants to respond to which question
I think
first.
he can do the middle powers question. He's just done a really fantastic article on it.
Yeah, no, I wanted to, because we actually just published at SAIIA, after Marconi's speech, there was a sense in many of us that this is really interesting and perhaps very similar to what we've been talking since Bandung, but is he really talking about us? And about us in the sense of your non-Australias, non-Canadas that we have been talking about. We looked into this report, particularly Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia. And I think what became clear to us is that it's very unlikely we're going to have an all-inclusive coalition of middle powers that are going to agree on everything and suddenly have a middle power-based global order. The idea there, I think, is to look for what is really that we have in common. And perhaps the idea of multilateralism is one of them. We tend to find multilateral institutions to be particularly beneficial to us because we simply don't get the same types of results when we operate alone. We see, despite disagreeing perhaps on much else at times, we still believe that by anchoring our responses within those institutions simply makes the predictability and sustainability of the global order in a way much more visible for us. But the question for me here is that what do we do then? Because if we look into the discussions around Security Council reform over the last couple of decades, they fundamentally talk from all sides, whether it's the G4, whether it's uniting for consensus, whether it's the Zawini consensus in the case of Africa. We talk about participation and having a seat at the table. Because Marconi talks about you're either at the table or you're on the menu, but nothing says that having a seat at the table that necessarily makes you influential. Has the African Union been particularly influential in the G20 discussions since its ascension? Perhaps an unfair point considering that the African Union has just joined, but we could dispute that. I think there is a much deeper structural conversation around what types of international mechanisms do we have, do we utilize, and how do we strengthen? And I think that is a particular comparative advantage that middle powers at the moment can have, noticing that we've already seen experiences like that. In the 2010s, the Security Council is completely blocked around humanitarian access to Syria. Who were the countries that were able to break that deadlock? Were countries like Australia, were countries like Kuwait, not a middle power perhaps in any way, shape, or form, but it's often by not being the superpowers is what provides us a much stronger ability of working together in a selected number of issues that we are actually able to agree rather than always pursuing the issues that we disagree on.
Thank you. So we have maybe 1 minute to respond to the question about the Germany and the EU.
So I would say for India, from the Indian viewpoint, working with the EU is really reinforcing all the bureaucracy in India. That's not great. And so I would feel better if we could work with individual countries, with Germany. And a good example is Indonesia, which works really very well and is bookended and backended by Japan, Australia, and Germany in so many issues. And it's become a fantastic trading power. We have a lot to learn. So I would say an individual country is easier, especially for India, which is getting back into global trade regimes.
Thank you so much. So one of my takeaways is that despite all the disagreements, multilateralism still seems to be indispensable, and we need to strengthen it. So thank you all for coming here, and thank you for the fascinating discussion and the insights.
Thank you.